Peter van Inwagen is one of the most respected metaphysicians of the late 20th century, early 21st century, and he has responded to the argument from evil that concludes that God does not exist. And I'm providing a brief overview of his response in this part one video. So there are a few different versions of the problem of evil that van Inwagen introduces and clarifies. And one thing that he says to make sure that it's clear, there are all kinds of issues that might fall under the phrase, the problem of evil. But so there's human suffering. How do we deal with human suffering? How does that affect us? How should we respond to one another? Those kinds of issues are not the issue here, right? The issue here in this context, the problem of evil means the problem that the existence of bad things or suffering raises for theists. It's only a problem for theists. It's a problem with how does evil exist and God exist. We start by describing some characteristics of God. God is theologically conceived as the greatest possible being. Now, we could go into much more detail. You can see my video on who is God to go through the various characteristics that God has. But God is conceived as omnipotent, and omnipotence means that God is able to do anything that is intrinsically possible. Now, this does rule out logically impossible things. They're not really things at all. They are words strung together like creating a round square. That such a thing is literally inconceivable, and it's also unimaginable. You cannot do that. But also this would restrict God, even if God were omnipotent, he could not act against his nature, because he's also omnibenevolent, all good. So not being able to lie or deceive is not a fault. It's something that's actually intrinsically impossible because God has these characteristics necessarily. So since God is morally perfect and has that characteristic necessarily, God has no moral defect whatsoever, and that's why God cannot lie. Now, just to make the problem really clear here, we also can emphasize God's omniscience. God knows about the evil that exists. So there's not going to be a path out by saying that, well, God didn't know that this evil was going on. That's not going to be an option for a theist with the traditionally conceived view of God. Now, what van Inwagen does, he sets up the argument as a dialogue. And so imagine a debate between an atheist on the one hand and a theist on the other hand, and they are in front of an ideal audience, an audience of agnostics. So they are completely open. They don't know who they might side with. And the atheist is presenting an argument for the conclusion that God does not exist. So it is the atheist that has the burden of proof. That's what is going on with the argument from evil. And van Inwagen says, just try to imagine this ideal audience. Now, obviously, this is probably impossible. You just don't find people who are completely neutral on this huge, vastly important topic. And so you have a lot of people may say they're agnostic, but they're really not open to the existence of God. So in any case, we have this as a setup, people who are open either way, and it's the burden of the atheist to convince the audience that they should be atheists as well. So van Inwagen clarifies that the argument from evil does not have the power to transform neutral agnostics into atheist. That's his thesis. It's going to fail in this kind of setting. Now, again, only one side of the debate is of concern, It's the atheists' attempt to turn agnostics into atheists. This is not going to be a debate where the theist tries to convince people to become theist. The theist is on the defense, so to speak. The atheist is on the offense, so to speak. It's the onus of the atheist to convince the audience that God does not exist. Okay, so that's the setup. How does the argument work? Here is the argument. God, who is morally perfect, must desire that evils not exist. It seems like someone who's morally perfect would not want evils to exist. An omnipotent being can do or bring about whatever he wants. Now, we go ahead and allow this qualification that is intrinsically possible. So it's understood by the atheist that the theist would need that qualification. The atheist agrees that that qualification is reasonable. The non-existence of evil is intrinsically possible. The atheist maintains, and that seems, again, plausible. And so if God exists and those three premises are true, then evil would not exist. And of course, now we have the arguments flowing, evil exists, and so therefore God does not exist. This seems very plausible, so it's worthy of investigation. A theist would need to provide some reason to think that this argument fails. Now, as a first response, note that there is a distinction between what one wants, what one can do, and what one will do. So this is related to the first premise that God, who is morally perfect, must desire that evils not exist, this wanting evil not to be there and his ability to eliminate evil. But wait a minute, is that what one will do? Now, here's an example that Van Inwagen provides. He talks about Alice, whose mother is terminally ill and in chronic pain and close to the end of her life. And Alice, with compassion, wants her mother to die, to be relieved of her suffering. In order to be relieved of pain, Alice wants her mother, to be over this and to go ahead and pass. And so Alice, we can imagine, has the ability to make her mother die, right? But she doesn't do it. She wants her mother to die. She can cause her mother to die, but she still doesn't do it. And we don't think poorly of Alice for that, right? Likewise, God might have reasons for allowing evil to exist, reasons that would outweigh the desirability of the non-existence of evil. And so we want to investigate these potential reasons. A theodicy is providing a reason that God would allow evil to exist. Now, we should clarify that, on the other hand, a defense is showing that the existence of evil is consistent with the existence of God. This is something that Alvin Plantinga has done. Bernstein and Helms have created a simpler free will defense. Here, Van Inwagen gives an example of Clarissa, a single mother. And you can imagine a defense. Somebody says that Clarissa is a terrible mother because they saw her leave her apartment at 3 a.m. and they knew that she had 2 children in there and she left them alone while she went out. And somebody else who knows Clarissa and hears this person say that Clarissa's a bad mother says, no, wait a minute. I know Clarissa's not a bad mother. Maybe one of her children was very ill, so she didn't want to take the child outside, but she needed to get some medication for that child. And so she went out to get some medication. Now, that's not being a bad mother. Well, some mothers might judge otherwise, but that seems to be plausible that it's possible that Clarissa is a good mother, and yet she actually left her children alone and left the apartment at 3 a.m. Here might be another example. Suppose Tom is an alcoholic who is recovering. He is in a relationship with someone else, and he has promised that person that he will not drink. That person then later sees Tom leaving a bar, and they conclude that Tom has been drinking, right? It seems plausible. Now, someone else is trying to defend Tom, and they say, you know what? Wait a minute. Part of the program is making amends. He likely had friends that he could only find in the bar that he needed to make amends with. And so that's why he went to the bar. He didn't drink. He was trying to make amends with some people there. That also would be a defense. In both of these cases, the individual in question doesn't know that that's what the case is. The person doesn't know Clarissa went to get medicine. The other person doesn't know that Tom went into the bar to make amends. But it tells a story that provides a defense. We can do the same thing with God and the existence of evil, Van Inwagen says. How do we do that? By the free will defense. So free will is a sufficient reason for God to allow evil. An indispensable part of the goodness in the world that God creates is the existence of rational beings, self-aware beings who are capable of abstract thought and love, and having the power of free choice between contemplating alternative courses of actions. Free creatures who have significant freedom, morally valuable choices in their life, opportunities to genuinely love other people or not. That is the context of free will. And especially that idea of love is valuable, right? In relationships that are chosen, when somebody loves someone else. This essentially involves free will. To see this, imagine a case where a really good engineer, computer scientist creates an android who very much looks human, passes as a human even, can go to a grocery store and no one would know it's an android, but he programs her to tell him how wonderful he is, how brilliant he is, and what her whole purpose in life is pleasing him. That's how she's programmed, and he decides to marry her. What do you think of such an individual? It just doesn't seem right. Why? Because the android did not have the free choice. It's all programming. And that doesn't seem like love at all. And so we need free will in order to love and have loving relationships. Now, how does that relate to evil? Well, even an omnipotent being is unable to control the exercise of the power of free choices. So to ask God to give me a free choice between X and Y, A and not A, and to make sure that I choose X instead of Y, to make sure that I do A, the good thing, instead of not A, the bad thing, is to ask God to bring about the intrinsically impossible. He can't do that. And so some or all human beings misuse this power of free choice, and it produced a certain amount of evil. Now that is a defense. This shows how God could exist, be omnipotent, omnibenevolent, morally perfect, and omniscient, and yet have humans who exist and have free will and cause evil. Now, of course, there are challenges to the free will defense. I want to consider two in this part 1 video. We'll consider others in part 2. So one challenge is that free will is compatible with strict causal determinism. Some philosophers have argued for this. This is the thesis of compatibilism. And so on the free will debate in metaphysics, there are philosophers who are compatibilists. They say that causal determinism can be true, which means you only have one possible future, which means that every apparent choice is actually already laid out in front of one, that one definitely will take one action. Now that's the thesis of compatibilism. If compatibilism is true, well then God could give people freedom and assure that they never do evil. Now, Van Inwagen's response to this is to note that the burden's not on the atheist, the burden is now on the atheist to convince the agnostic that compatibilism is the correct theory of free will in order to undermine the free will defense. That is what must be done. You have to convince the agnostic that compatibilism is correct, right? Is more likely true than incompatibilism. But compatibilism is implausible, Van Inwagen argues. And he has written books on this topic, thoroughly explaining why we should think compatibilism is implausible. It is convincing to many people. And so at the least, it might be something that's possible, but the agnostic should not be convinced that it is correct, given the state of the debate. Okay, other challenges to the free will defense. The second one, it seems like the existence of a being who knows the future is going to be incompatible with free will. If God knows what you're going to do, that you're going to choose A instead of not A, X instead of Y, then you're not really free in regards to those choices. Now, Van Inwagen's response is not one that is that common among theists, but it is growing. What he says is, look, even an omniscient being is unable to know something if knowing that thing would be intrinsically impossible. If that state of knowing it would be an intrinsically possible state of affairs. And the idea here is that since free action in the future are not completed, God actually does not know what's going to happen, but it's intrinsically impossible to know what's going to happen. So that's not a fault of omniscience. There's nothing to know for free actions in the future. And so not knowing it is not a weakness in God. And so free will is compatible with God. Now, there is another response. In fact, there are many other responses to this concern about free will and God's foreknowledge. And obviously, it's a topic that we can't explore thoroughly, but very briefly, other theists say something along this line. Look, knowing what someone will do doesn't cause them to do it. So you may have a good friend and you're really confident about what they're going to do. You may even know what they're going to do in a given situation. Maybe your friend has a political office and somebody's going to offer him a bribe, and you know your friend and you know the bribe is going to be turned down. So you may know what somebody else will freely do, right? And so since there's not the causation between knowing and causing the person to do it, the person could still be free, and yet it could be known what they're going to do. Something along those lines is a response that is common for other theists. So one could take either response to show that the existence of an omniscient being is compatible with free will. So there are other concerns about, once we grant the free will defense, what might be other objections after that, and how would we respond to those other objections? And those we are going to explore in part 2.